Britain founded Australia in 1788 as a solution to a prison overcrowding problem, not as a settlement, not as a colony of prosperity, as a dumping ground for its criminals at the furthest possible point from London to remove them permanently from British society. For the first 80 years, Australia was essentially a labor camp at the edge of the world. Today, Australia's GDP per capita is $64,407. Britain's is $52,637. The prison is 22% richer than the jailer. 3 decisions made the difference. Britain had the chance to make all 3 of them and chose differently every time. Founded as a prison, now 22% richer than the country that built it. 3 decisions Britain made wrong and Australia made right. The Australia-UK comparison is not just about which country is richer. It is about what decisions compound over 200 years. Australia in 1788 had nothing. No capital, no free settlers by choice, no infrastructure, no institutional continuity beyond the prison system Britain installed. The UK in 1788 had everything: the world's most advanced industrial economy, the most powerful navy on Earth, the largest empire in history, and centuries of institutional development. That Australia has overtaken Britain in per capita income is not an accident of geography or resources. It is the outcome of 3 specific decisions made at 3 specific moments, each of which Britain also faced and chose differently. Chapter 1. 1788. The world's most unlikely colony. The first fleet arrived at Botany Bay on January 18, 1788. 11 ships, 1,530 people. Of those, 778 were convicts, men and women transported for crimes that today would earn a fine or a community service order: stealing a handkerchief, poaching a rabbit, receiving stolen goods. These were the founders of Australia, not by choice but by sentence. Britain's decision to found a penal colony at the far end of the earth was driven by one specific crisis: the American Revolution. Before 1776, Britain had shipped tens of thousands of convicts to its American colonies, where they served as cheap labor and were eventually freed to join colonial society. The American Revolution ended that arrangement overnight. British prisons, already overcrowded, began filling beyond capacity. The hulks, decommissioned ships used as floating prisons, were becoming unmanageable. Australia was the solution: remote enough that transport was itself a punishment, large enough to absorb unlimited numbers, and empty enough, in British eyes, that there was no one to complain about the arrangement. The indigenous population, who had lived on the continent for 65,000 years, were not consulted. For the first 80 years, the colony was precisely what Britain intended it to be: a labor camp. Convicts worked for free or for minimal rations. The land belonged to the Crown, administered by governors appointed in London. The economy consisted largely of what Britain needed extracted from it: wool, timber, fish, rather than what its population needed to prosper. By the standards of the time, it was efficient. By any other standard, it was designed to fail. Before I explain what changed, I want you to hold this image. Britain in 1788 was the most powerful country on Earth. It had institutions built over centuries. It had capital, technology, and global trade networks. Australia was a prison at the edge of the world. If you had to bet in 1788 on which would be richer in 2025, you would bet on Britain with overwhelming confidence, and you would be wrong. The question is, why?
Chapter 2. Decision 1. Gold and Democracy, 1851. The first decision was made for Australia by geology rather than politics, but the political consequences were everything. In 1851, gold was discovered in New South Wales and Victoria. The rush that followed was extraordinary by the standards of any gold rush in history. In 1852 alone, 370,000 people arrived in Victoria, tripling the colony's population in a single year. These were not convicts. They were free people who had chosen to come, who had paid their own passage, and who had no intention of accepting the authoritarian colonial governance that convict Australia had always known. The Eureka Stockade of 1854, a rebellion of gold miners against an unjust licensing system, was crushed militarily, but its political consequences could not be suppressed. Within 2 years, Victoria had introduced full male suffrage and a secret ballot. Within 15 years, all 6 Australian colonies had representative parliaments. Australia invented the secret ballot. It spread from there to Britain, the United States, and eventually the world. The country that Britain founded as a prison became within 60 years one of the most democratic polities on earth. What was Britain doing at the same moment? Defending the existing franchise. The Reform Act of 1832 had extended the vote to some middle-class men, but the majority of British men and all women would wait until 1918 to vote. Britain was managing its political evolution slowly, conservatively, and in ways that preserved existing power structures. Australia, with no existing power structure to protect, moved faster and further. Chapter 3. Decision 2. Hawke-Keating and the Open Economy, 1983 to 1996. The second decision was economic, and it was made, of all things, by a Labour government that believed in markets more than any Conservative government before it had dared to. In 1983, Australia was a highly protected economy. Tariffs on manufactured goods were among the highest in the developed world. The financial sector was tightly regulated, with only domestic banks allowed, and interest rates set by the government. The dollar was pegged. Immigration was controlled by a points system, but relatively modest. The economy worked, but it had been insulated from global competition for so long that it had stopped needing to improve. Bob Hawke, who won the 1983 election on a platform of consensus and economic pragmatism, and his treasurer Paul Keating, began dismantling what both men called the Great Wall of Protection. The dollar was floated in 1983. Foreign banks were allowed to enter the Australian market in 1985. Tariffs on manufactured goods were progressively cut through the late 1980s and 1990s. The Prices and Incomes Accord, a deal between the government and trade unions that traded wage restraint for improved social services, allowed inflation to be reduced without the mass unemployment that Britain experienced in the same period. The results were remarkable. Australia avoided the recession of 1990 to 1991 for the first time, or rather, the recession it did have in 1991 was brief and shallow compared to Britain's. By 1993, Australian productivity growth was accelerating. By 1997, Australian GDP per capita had overtaken several European countries. The 29-year recession-free record that Australia subsequently built, ending only with COVID in 2020, traces its roots directly to the structural changes Hawke and Keating made in the 1983 to 1996 period. What was Britain doing in the same period? Margaret Thatcher also reformed the British economy, privatising state industries, defeating the unions, and cutting top tax rates. The reforms were real and consequential, but they were also accompanied by mass unemployment, the destruction of entire communities dependent on coal and steel, and a financial sector liberalization that contributed directly to the instability that eventually produced the 2008 financial crisis. Britain got the pain of reform with less of the long-run gain. The key difference is institutional. Australia's reform was built on consensus, the Accord, which meant it was sustained across multiple governments. Britain's was imposed, which meant it was contested, partially reversed, and never fully embedded in the way that a consensual reform can be.
Chapter 4. Decision 3. Asia, not Atlantic, 1957 to 1990. The third decision is the one the Canada versus Australia episode told in depth, and it bears repeating here because it is the single factor that most directly explains the 22% gap. Australia's decision to pivot its economic relationships toward Asia began, as this channel has covered, with Menzies' 1957 commerce agreement with Japan. By the 1980s, it had deepened into APEC membership, free trade agreements with Japan, Korea, China, and ASEAN, and a strategic commitment to the Asia-Pacific as Australia's natural economic home. Britain, with the same opportunity, the post-war industrialization of Asia represented an open invitation for any economy willing to supply the raw materials and finished goods that rapid development required, chose instead to double down on its Atlantic relationships. The European Economic Community in 1973, NATO, the special relationship with the United States. These were real strategic choices, not failures of imagination, but they were choices that oriented Britain toward an already developed world rather than toward the fastest-growing part of the global economy. Then came Brexit. In 2016, Britain voted to leave the EU, the largest single market to which it had access, the framework that had done for Britain's European trade what APEC had done for Australia's Asian trade. The arguments for Brexit were many and genuinely held. The economic consequences have been measurable and negative. British trade with the EU has fallen, foreign investment has slowed, and the productivity gains that EU membership produced have begun to erode. Britain is still a large, advanced, wealthy economy, but it is growing more slowly than it should be, and it made a choice in 2016 that has not helped. Chapter 5. Where they are now. The first is the debt-to-GDP ratio. Australia, 50.9%. Britain, 103.9%. Britain is running a debt load that is double Australia's as a share of its economy. The deficit as a share of GDP, Australia, 2.16%, Britain, 5.75%. Britain is not just spending more than it earns, it is doing so at more than twice Australia's rate, starting from twice the debt. The fiscal headroom that Australia has to invest in the future, in infrastructure, in defense, in the energy transition, is dramatically larger than Britain's. The second is immigration. Australia's immigration policy is points-based, skilled worker-focused, and produces a net positive fiscal contribution per immigrant. Britain's immigration debate has been dominated for a decade by Brexit and its aftermath, producing a system that is simultaneously more restricted for European workers, who were previously the easiest to integrate, and less controlled for non-European migrants. The result has been political chaos rather than coherent demographic management. Australia has maintained one of the highest immigration rates among OECD countries while maintaining public consensus around that immigration. Britain has not. The third is productivity growth. Australian workers produce approximately $83 of output per hour worked. British workers produce approximately $74. This 12% productivity gap, which is smaller than the Germany-Japan gap but nonetheless significant, reflects 40 years of compounding reform advantage. Every reform that increased Australian workers' access to capital, technology, and competitive markets left a residue of higher productivity. That residue compounds. Chapter 6. What it actually means. The Australia-UK comparison is often read as a story about Britain's decline. That is the wrong frame. Britain is not in decline. It is a wealthy, stable, democratic country with world-class institutions, extraordinary cultural output, and a productive economy. Its GDP per capita of $52,637 ranks it 23rd in the world. That is not failure. The correct frame is what can happen to a country that makes the right decisions consistently over a long period, starting from almost nothing. Australia in 1788 had negative institutional capital. It was not a blank slate, it was a deficit. Everything that exists in Australia today, its democracy, its universities, its research sector, its cities, was built from scratch, largely by people who did not choose to be there. The three decisions the episode has described were not obvious at the time. Gold creating democracy was accidental. Nobody planned the Eureka Stockade as a constitutional moment. Hawke and Keating reforming a labor electorate that wanted protection required political courage that lost them votes in the short run. The Asia pivot required Menzies to look past a war that had killed tens of thousands of Australians and see a trading partner rather than a former enemy. Britain faced the equivalent of each of these decisions: when to reform the franchise, how aggressively to open the economy, whether to orient toward Asia or the Atlantic. At each moment, it chose the more cautious path, the more conservative option, the option that preserved existing arrangements rather than risking them. These were not wrong choices in the abstract. Caution is often wisdom. But the cumulative effect of choosing caution repeatedly over 150 years, while Australia chose transformation, is a 22% gap in per capita income. Britain founded Australia as a prison. It sent its surplus people there to be forgotten. Those people built something. 3 decisions later, the prison is richer than the jailer. This is Macro Atlas. Thank you for watching.